I was still holding my bouquet when my sister decided to turn my wedding into a performance. The microphone squealed softly as she tapped it, smiling at the 204 guests seated beneath crystal chandeliers. I remember the exact number because I had counted every RSVP myself, carefully, obsessively wanting everything to be perfect. Wanting, maybe foolishly, for this day to prove that I belonged. Vanessa lifted her champagne glass and laughed lightly, the way she always did when she knew the room was hers. "Let's be honest," she said, her voice amplified through the speakers, smooth and deliberate. "After the divorce, I got the lucky life. Brianna got character." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd. She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then she delivered the line that froze my blood. "But look at her now, the poor side of the family finally looks presentable." The words didn't just echo in the ballroom. They echoed through 30 years of my life. 30 years since the divorce split our childhood in half. Vanessa in our wealthy mother's mansion, me in my father's tiny wooden house on the edge of town. 30 years of watching my sister grow up, surrounded by designer labels and country club brunches, while I learned to sew loose buttons back onto secondhand dresses. 30 years of pretending it didn't hurt when my mother forgot my birthdays but flew across the country for Vanessa's cheer competitions. 30 years of convincing myself that love didn't need to be loud to be real. And still, some part of me had hoped my wedding would be different. I had built my own success quietly. I had never asked my mother for a dime. I had organized over 200 weddings for other brides, crafting perfect moments for strangers. But standing there in white silk, listening to my sister reduce my entire life to a punchline, I felt 6 years old again, unwanted, unchosen, unseen. I opened my mouth to defend myself. But before I could say a word, my husband stood up. And what he said next didn't just silence the room. It unraveled every secret my family had buried for 3 decades. "If you've ever been humiliated by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay with me, because this wasn't just a wedding speech. It was the moment everything changed." My name is Brianna Blake. I'm 36 years old, and I own an event planning company that has organized more than 200 weddings over the past 5 years. I've built entire celebrations from nothing but sketches and scattered ideas. I've watched brides walk down aisles I designed, seen fathers cry under floral arches I chose, and listened to vows echo in ballrooms I helped transform into something magical. I know how to make a wedding perfect. What I didn't know, at least not until recently, was how to protect my own. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. Not just about a wedding gone wrong, but about what happens when 30 years of silence finally breaks. About what it feels like to grow up as the child who wasn't chosen. And about the moment I stopped asking for love from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. To understand what happened at my wedding, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when I was 6 years old and my parents divorced. Vanessa, my younger sister, was only 2 at the time, too small to understand what custody arrangements meant. Too young to realize that a judge's decision could quietly divide a childhood into 2 completely different futures. The agreement sounded reasonable on paper. I would live with my father because I was closer to him. Vanessa would stay with our mother because she was still so young. Adults called it practical, fair, sensible. But what looked balanced in a courtroom didn't feel balanced in real life. My father and I moved into a small wooden house on the edge of town. It had creaky floors and thin walls. In the winter, you could feel the wind slipping through cracks in the window frames. In the summer, the air conditioner rattled like it might give up at any second. We didn't have much, but what we had was steady. Dad cooked dinner every night, even if it was simple. He showed up to school recitals. He fixed broken shelves himself instead of calling someone else to do it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But it was real. Meanwhile, Vanessa grew up in our mother's world, a world of marble countertops, designer handbags, and dinner parties where people smiled with perfectly whitened teeth. Our mother remarried a wealthy businessman named Richard not long after the divorce. With him came private schools, country club memberships, and a house so large it felt more like a hotel than a home. As a child, I didn't think in terms of money or status. I thought in terms of presence. And slowly, almost invisibly, my mother's presence in my life began to shrink. At first, she visited every weekend like she promised. Then it became every other weekend. Then once a month. Then, "I'll call you soon, sweetheart," which often meant weeks of silence. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming fights, no explosive arguments, just quiet absence. I remember the first time I noticed the difference. I was 9 years old, sitting at our kitchen table while Dad helped me with math homework. The phone rang, and I ran to answer it, hoping it was Mom. It was. But the call lasted 3 minutes. 2 of those minutes were about Vanessa's dance recital. I told myself not to feel jealous. Good sisters aren't jealous. Good daughters are understanding. That's what I believed for years. I convinced myself that if I was easy, independent, low maintenance, she would have more space to love me. So I became the strong one. By 14, I had learned how to celebrate myself quietly. That was the year I earned a full academic scholarship to a competitive high school program. I was shaking when I dialed my mother's number. For a moment, I let myself imagine her pride. The kind of pride that fills a voice and lingers. "That's nice," she said when I told her. Then she changed the subject. "Vanessa just made the cheerleading squad. Isn't that wonderful?" I sat on my bed after we hung up, staring at the wall, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. From that day on, I stopped calling her with good news. Not because I stopped achieving, but because I stopped expecting applause. I worked harder. I built things. I learned early that if I wanted something stable, I had to create it myself. College scholarships, internships, business plans scribbled late at night in tiny apartments with peeling paint. Every step of my life was built without her guidance, without her financial help, without her validation. And maybe that's why I became so good at what I do now. When you grow up piecing together your own emotional stability, you get very skilled at building beautiful structures from fragile materials. By the time I turned 36, I had a thriving event planning company. Clients flew in from other states to work with me. I had organized over 200 weddings, each one meticulously planned, each detail carefully chosen. I knew how to manage egos, budgets, seating charts, and last-minute disasters. What I didn't know was how to manage my own family. Because even after 3 decades of distance, even after years of learning not to expect too much, some small, stubborn part of me still wanted my mother to show up. That's why I invited her to a private dinner when Daniel and I got engaged. That's why I called twice to confirm. That's why I convinced myself that maybe this time, this one moment, she would look at me and see not the reminder of a failed marriage, not the inconvenient daughter left behind, but simply her child. I should have recognized the pattern by then. But hope is a hard habit to break. If you've ever been the overlooked child, the one who learned to be fine because it was easier than asking for more, you probably understand this kind of hope. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It tells you, maybe this time will be different. And that whisper followed me all the way to my wedding day. I didn't know then that the same divide that shaped my childhood would be on full display in front of 204 guests. I didn't know that the small wooden house where I grew up would become a punchline. I didn't know that 30 years of silence would collapse into one unforgettable moment. But it did. And before I tell you what happened under those chandeliers, you need to understand something important. I wasn't weak. I wasn't unsuccessful. And I certainly wasn't poor. I was simply the daughter who learned to survive without being chosen. And this is the story of what happens when that daughter finally decides she doesn't need to be chosen anymore. The night Daniel proposed to me, I said yes before he even finished the question. Not because I was overwhelmed by the ring, though it was beautiful, or because the restaurant he chose overlooked the skyline in a way that made the whole city look like it was glittering just for us. I said yes because when he looked at me, I never felt like I had to compete for space in his eyes. I wasn't compared. I wasn't measured. I wasn't silently ranked against someone else. I was simply enough. Daniel had always been different in that way. He was a software engineer, steady, analytical, calm, in situations where most people panicked. He noticed things other people missed. The way I tensed slightly when my mother's name lit up my phone. The way I brushed off stories about my childhood with a light laugh that didn't quite reach my eyes. He never pushed, but he never ignored it either. He had this quiet way of waiting until I was ready to tell the truth. When we decided to announce our engagement, I insisted on inviting my mother and Vanessa to dinner. I told myself it was the mature thing to do, the right thing. But if I'm honest, it was something else entirely. It was hope, dressed up as etiquette. I wanted one evening where we could sit at the same table without tension hiding beneath every sentence. I wanted my mother to look at Daniel and see the man who loved her daughter, not a resume to be evaluated. I chose one of the nicest restaurants in the city. I made the reservation 3 weeks in advance. I called twice to confirm. I even arrived early that evening, smoothing my dress nervously while Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. "They'll be here," he said gently. I nodded, pretending I didn't notice the clock. They arrived 40 minutes late. No apology, no explanation beyond my mother adjusting her designer scarf and saying, "Traffic was terrible." Vanessa followed behind her, flawless as always, sliding into her seat across from Daniel like she was preparing for an interview panel. "So, Daniel," she began with a polished smile, "what exactly do you do?" "Software engineering," he answered politely. "Oh? For what company?" he told her. "And what's the salary range for that position?" The question hung in the air, sharp and inappropriate. I felt heat creep up my neck, but Daniel remained composed. He answered calmly, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to want. My mother watched with mild interest, as though this were normal conversation. I tried to steer things toward lighter topics, the proposal, the ring, how we met, but Vanessa kept circling back to finances, status, prestige. It was subtle enough that no one could accuse her of being rude, yet pointed enough that I could feel the message underneath. Is he good enough? Is this wedding going to reflect well on us? When my mother finally turned to me, it wasn't to ask how I felt or what the proposal meant to me. It was, "Where are you planning to hold the wedding?" Something appropriate, I hope. "Appropriate?" I echoed lightly. "Well, you know," she continued, lowering her voice as though she were offering advice. "We don't want it to feel modest." I swallowed. I could have told her that I own a successful event planning company, that I had organized over 200 weddings, including one for the governor's daughter just last spring, that clients book me months in advance and trust my vision implicitly. But something inside me hesitated. She had never asked about my work, not once, and I had stopped volunteering information years ago. Dinner ended with polite smiles and air kisses. As Daniel and I walked to the car, I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the kind that doesn't stab but lingers, dull and persistent. We were almost at the parking lot when I heard Vanessa's voice drifting through the glass windows behind us. "I just hope this wedding doesn't embarrass our family." I stopped walking. Daniel looked at me, eyes searching. "Did you hear that?" I forced a small smile. "I'm used to it." But that wasn't entirely true. You never really get used to being the comparison point. The standard of what not to be. The quiet sibling who made success look accidental while someone else's mediocrity was celebrated as extraordinary. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment of dinner. I thought about being 14 again, clutching the phone after telling my mother about my scholarship, about the way she had pivoted the conversation to Vanessa's cheerleading uniform. I realized something uncomfortable. Even at 36, part of me was still waiting for her to clap. The weeks leading up to the wedding should have been joyful. I knew how to plan events. I lived for timelines, vendor calls, fabric swatches, floral palettes. But this time felt different. This time, the client was me. And suddenly, every decision carried emotional weight. When my mother called a few days later and offered to help, I hesitated. I knew the pattern. I knew that help from her often came with invisible strings. But I also knew that refusing her would be interpreted as rejection. So I agreed. Within days, the tone shifted. She called my caterer directly and changed the menu. The simple, elegant dishes Daniel and I had chosen were replaced with expensive, elaborate options I had never requested. When I confronted her, she sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Darling, you can't serve that kind of food to Richard's business associates. What would they think?" I hadn't known Richard's business associates were invited. Apparently, they were now. She handed me a revised guest list with 50 additional names. 50 strangers. 50 people who had nothing to do with my life but everything to do with hers. When I protested, she waved a dismissive hand. You don't understand how these things work. But I did understand how these things worked. I had built a career on understanding them. This wasn't about etiquette. It was about image. Soon after, I discovered she had reorganized the seating chart, dividing tables into VIP and regular. Her friends and Richard's colleagues were placed near the stage, beneath the most dramatic lighting. My friends and Daniel's family were pushed toward the back. When I objected, she said, "Important people shouldn't feel like afterthoughts." Important people. I didn't ask the question forming in my mind. I already knew the answer. Daniel noticed the shift in me, the tightness in my shoulders, the way I reviewed vendor contracts at midnight like I was bracing for impact. "She's not helping," he said one evening, gently but firmly. "She's turning your wedding into her show." I wanted to defend her. Old habits die slowly, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I admitted something I had never said out loud before. "I think I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm not an embarrassment." Daniel took my hands in his. "You never were." I'd not nose in. His certainty unsettled me more than my mother's criticism ever had. Because if he was right, then all those years of trying had been unnecessary. And that realization was both freeing and terrifying. As the wedding approached, tension layered itself quietly over every detail. I kept telling myself it would settle once the day arrived. That once I walked down the aisle, nothing else would matter. I didn't know then that the division I had lived with since childhood was about to be displayed in front of 204 guests. I didn't know that the careful silence I had maintained for 30 years was about to be shattered in a single sentence. And I didn't yet understand that Daniel's promise, "If they cross the line, I won't stay silent," was not a figure of speech. It was a warning. If I'm being honest, the first person who ever made me question the story I had been telling myself for 30 years was Daniel. I had always described my childhood as fine. Not tragic, not abusive, just fine. My father worked hard. We had food on the table. I earned scholarships. I built a career. On paper, nothing about my life demanded sympathy, and I hated the idea of sounding ungrateful. So, whenever the subject of my mother came up, I would shrug lightly and say, "We're just different." Whenever someone asked about Vanessa, I would smile and reply, "She's always been the glamorous one." Daniel never challenged those words directly. He just watched my face when I said them. We met at a corporate gala I was organizing 3 years before our wedding. He was part of the tech team hired to handle a live product launch. I remember noticing how calm he was when the lighting system glitched 10 minutes before the CEO's speech. While everyone else panicked, Daniel simply knelt beside the equipment, rolled up his sleeves, and fixed the issue without raising his voice. There was something about that steadiness that drew me in. Not dramatic, not flashy, just reliable. We started talking that night, first about work, then about books, then about nothing important at all. He didn't seem impressed by the scale of the event or the high-profile guests. He was more interested in asking how I handled pressure, how I built my company from scratch, what had pushed me to become so independent, so young. No one had ever asked me that before. Our relationship grew quietly. He met my father early on, and they bonded over simple things: home repairs, grilling techniques, bad puns. Watching them together did something unexpected inside me. It showed me what family could look like when it wasn't complicated. But when it came to my mother and Vanessa, I remained guarded. The first time Daniel saw that side of my life up close was during a holiday dinner at my mother's house. The place looked like it belonged in a magazine: towering ceilings, polished marble floors, art pieces that cost more than my first apartment. Vanessa arrived late, of course, sweeping in with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the focal point. Throughout the evening, the comparisons began subtly. Vanessa mentioned her upcoming trip to Europe. My mother praised her new designer handbag. When Daniel asked me about a recent event I had planned, a 3-day wedding retreat that required months of coordination, my mother interrupted with a polite but dismissive smile. "Brianna is always busy," she said. as though it were a hobby, not a thriving business. I felt the familiar instinct to shrink, to downplay, to change the subject. But Daniel didn't. "That's incredible," he said, looking at me. "Not them. She built her company from nothing." The table went quiet for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for anyone to call it awkward, but long enough for me to feel the shift. Later that night, in the car, Daniel asked gently, "Does it always feel like that?" "Like what?" I deflected. "Like you're being compared." I stared out the window. City lights blurred into streaks. I had no easy answer. Comparison had been the air I breathed growing up. It didn't feel unusual. It felt normal. "She just worries about appearances," I said finally. "That's all." Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The proposal came a year later on a quiet rooftop terrace. No audience. No elaborate staging. Just Daniel, a small velvet box, and a voice that didn't tremble when he said, "I don't ever want you to feel second in your own life again." It's Sanchis. At the time, I thought it was romantic exaggeration. I didn't realize it was a promise. After we set a tentative date, I made the decision to involve my mother and Vanessa in the engagement announcement. It felt like extending an olive branch, like proving to myself that I was mature enough to move beyond childhood resentments. We reserved a private dining room at one of the city's most elegant restaurants. I chose it carefully: neutral decor, refined atmosphere, understated luxury. It reflected me. The evening unfolded exactly as it always did when the four of us shared a table. My mother arrived late, brushing off the delay. Vanessa asked Daniel about his salary before asking how he proposed. Every sentence carried an undertone of evaluation. I watched Daniel navigate it with patience. He answered their questions without defensiveness. He remained polite, even warm. But I could see the slight tightening in his jaw, the way his hand would occasionally brush mine under the table as if grounding me. When my mother asked about the wedding venue and whether we could afford something suitable, something inside me wavered. I had orchestrated luxury events for people who never once questioned my competence. Yet here I was, being measured by the very people who had never supported my climb. After dinner, when Vanessa's comment about not embarrassing the family reached my ears through the restaurant window, Daniel stopped walking. "That's not okay," he said quietly. "I'm used to it," I replied automatically. He turned to face me fully. "You shouldn't have to be." That sentence lingered longer than any insult Vanessa had thrown. In the days that followed, as wedding planning intensified, I began to notice how often I minimized my own feelings. When my mother changed the catering menu without asking, I told myself she meant well. When she added 50 of Richard's associates to the guest list, I framed it as networking. When she reorganized the seating chart into tiers of importance, I tried to convince myself it was strategic. Daniel saw through all of it. "She's rewriting your wedding to fit her narrative," he said one evening as we reviewed vendor contracts at the kitchen table. "And you're letting her." To Jay. The words weren't accusatory, they were concerned. I felt defensive at first. Not of her, exactly, but of the version of me that still wanted approval. "If I push back too hard, it'll become a whole thing," I explained. "I don't want drama." He studied me for a moment. "Brianna, avoiding drama at the cost of your own boundaries isn't peace. It's self-erasure." Self-erasure. I had never thought of it that way. For years, I had believed I was being strong by absorbing discomfort quietly, by not reacting, by not demanding more. But what if that strength had slowly turned into invisibility? As the wedding approached, I found myself caught between two instincts. The old one: stay quiet, keep the peace, endure. And a newer, unfamiliar one: speak, assert, protect. Daniel sensed the shift in me before I fully recognized it myself. One night, after another tense phone call with my mother about decor upgrades I hadn't approved, I sat at the edge of our bed staring at nothing. He sat beside me and took my hand. "If they cross the line," he said softly, "I won't stay silent." I looked at him, unsure what that would mean. My entire life had been shaped by silence, mine, my mother's, even my father's, in his own way. The idea of someone speaking up on my behalf felt both comforting and terrifying. "What if it makes things worse?" I whispered. He squeezed my hand. "Worse than 30 years of feeling small?" That question followed me into sleep. I didn't yet know that the line would be crossed in front of 204 guests. I didn't know that Daniel's calm would become the sharpest weapon in the room. I didn't know that the narrative my mother had carefully curated for decades would unravel in less than 2 minutes. But I was beginning to understand something crucial. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone at the table. And that changed everything. When my mother offered to help with the wedding preparations, I should have known it wouldn't be simple. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing floral mock-ups in my office. Her voice was warm, almost sweet. "Brianna, sweetheart, I've been thinking. A wedding is such an important event. Let me help you. I want it to be perfect." Perfect. It was a word that sounded generous, but in my experience with her, it often meant controlled. Still, I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. A small part of me, stubborn and childlike, wanted to believe that this was her way of showing up for me. Maybe this time she wouldn't turn it into a comparison. Maybe this time she would simply be my mother. Within 48 hours, the tone shifted. I found out not because she told me, but because my caterer called to confirm the updated selections. Updated selections. I stared at my phone in confusion. Daniel and I had chosen a simple, elegant menu: seasonal vegetables, herb-crusted salmon, a rustic dessert bar. It reflected us unpretentious, warm, thoughtful. "What updates?" I asked. "Well," the caterer said cautiously, "your mother requested the premium package. Lobster medallions, imported truffles, an additional wine pairing." My chest tightened. "Without consulting me?" "She said she had your approval." Of course she did. I drove to her house that evening, rehearsing calm sentences in my head. When I confronted her, she barely looked up from her tablet. "Darling, you can't serve something so modest to Richard's associates," she said lightly. "These people have certain expectations." "I didn't know Richard's associates were invited," I replied. She smiled as if I were being naive. "Well, they are now. It's important." Important. The word landed heavier this time. She handed me a revised guest list. 50 additional names. 50 people I had never met. CEOs, investors, socialites. My wedding was becoming a networking event, disguised as a celebration. "Mom, this isn't a corporate gala," I said carefully. "It's my wedding, and that's exactly why it needs to be done properly," she responded. "Trust me, Brianna. You don't understand how these circles work." I almost laughed at the irony. I had built my career navigating those exact circles. I understood image, perception, social hierarchy. I just didn't believe my marriage needed to impress anyone. But arguing felt exhausting. For years, every disagreement with her had followed the same pattern. She framed her control as wisdom. I reacted emotionally. She sighed, and I eventually stepped back to avoid escalation. So I tried to compromise. "Fine, we can keep some upgrades, but I want the final decisions." She nodded, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't finished. A few days later, I discovered she had reorganized the seating chart. I was reviewing the layout file late at night when I noticed new labels: VIP and General. My stomach dropped. Her friends and Richard's business associates were seated near the stage, under the most dramatic lighting, close to the dance floor. My father, Daniel's parents, my closest friends, the people who had supported me when no one else did, were placed toward the back. When I called her, she answered with breezy confidence. "It's just practical," she explained. "Important people shouldn't feel like afterthoughts." "And my father?" I asked quietly. "Where does he fall?" There was a brief pause. "Brianna, don't make this emotional. Don't make this emotional." It was always the same. The implication that my feelings were excessive, irrational, inconvenient. I drove to Daniel's apartment that night, feeling a mixture of anger and something worse, shame. Shame that I hadn't anticipated this. Shame that I was still surprised by her priorities. Daniel listened as I explained everything: the menu changes, the guest list expansion, the seating divisions. He didn't interrupt. He didn't jump to conclusions, he just absorbed it. "She's turning your wedding into her show," he said finally. I opened my mouth to defend her, but stopped. The defense felt hollow even before it formed. "I think I just wanted her to care," I admitted softly. He reached for my hand. "Control isn't care." That sentence settled into me like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples kept spreading long after he spoke it. Vanessa, meanwhile, inserted herself into the planning in more subtle ways. She volunteered to help me choose my dress. For a moment, I let myself believe it might be a chance for something genuine between us one afternoon where we weren't competing shadows. The bridal boutique was bright and elegant, mirrors lining every wall. I stepped into the first gown, a simple white silhouette that felt like me. I turned toward Vanessa, hopeful. She tilted her head. "Maybe ivory would be better," she said casually. "It hides flaws." Flaws. I looked down at myself instinctively, as though searching for what she meant. When I tried a fitted style, she suggested something looser. "More forgiving around the midsection," she added with a light laugh. Every comment was wrapped in the tone of helpfulness. Anyone overhearing would think she was supportive. But I heard the subtext clearly. "You're almost enough, but not quite." By the time we left the boutique, my excitement had dulled. I chose a dress I loved, but the joy of the moment felt muted. A few days later, I went to my mother's house to finalize floral arrangements. She stepped into another room to take a call, leaving her laptop open on the coffee table. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching for anything. But my eyes caught the file name automatically. Vanessa Wedding Plan 2025. Curiosity pulled me closer. I clicked. 47 pages. Venue comparisons, color palettes, detailed budget breakdowns, honeymoon destinations, even notes about potential guest themes and signature cocktails. Vanessa wasn't engaged. She didn't even have a serious relationship at the time. When my mother returned, I gestured to the screen. "What's this?" "Oh, that," she replied casually. "I'm just preparing in advance. Every daughter deserves a perfect wedding." Every daughter. The words echoed in my head long after I left. Apparently, perfection was something she planned lovingly for Vanessa. For me, it was something she corrected, adjusted, upgraded, because my version wasn't good enough. That night, lying beside Daniel, I finally told him about the document, about the 47 pages of care that had never existed for me. He didn't look surprised. He looked sad. "You've spent your life trying to earn something that should have been given freely," he said quietly. I stared at the ceiling, replaying years of small dismissals. Scholarship phone calls cut short. Achievements overlooked. Seating charts divided by importance. Maybe the wedding wasn't the real issue. Maybe it was the final mirror. As the weeks narrowed toward the ceremony, the atmosphere felt heavier. Invitations were sent, final fittings scheduled, deposits paid. On the surface, everything looked flawless. But beneath it, I felt something building, not anger exactly, but awareness. For 30 years, I had allowed the narrative to remain unchallenged. The successful but secondary daughter. The capable but less impressive one. The strong one who didn't need as much. I didn't yet know how that narrative would collapse. I didn't know that a microphone, a single sentence, and 204 witnesses would force every unspoken truth into the open. But I could feel the tension tightening. And this time, I wasn't sure I would be the only one staying silent. By the time the wedding week arrived, I was no longer naive about what was happening. I just hadn't decided yet whether I was going to stop it. On the surface, everything looked spectacular. The venue was one of the most elegant ballrooms in the city. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. It was a space I had admired for years while planning other people's weddings. I knew exactly how the light would hit the marble floors at sunset. I knew how the acoustics carried music softly across the room. I had envisioned walking into that space as a bride, not as a coordinator scanning for potential disasters. But this time, I wasn't just managing timelines and floral deliveries. I was managing history. 2 days before the wedding, my planner Sam pulled me aside during a final walkthrough. Sam had worked with me on dozens of events. She knew how I operated. how I handled pressure, how rarely I let emotions interfere with logistics. When she said she needed to talk privately, I knew it wasn't about table linens. "There's something you should probably know," she said carefully. My chest tightened immediately. "What happened?" "It's not a vendor issue," she clarified. "It's your sister." I exhaled slowly. "Of course it is. She's been asking very specific questions about your budget," Sam continued, comparing line items, asking what's covered by you and what's covered by your mother. It felt less like curiosity and more like auditing. Auditing. That word made my stomach twist. "Comparing to what?" I asked. Sam hesitated. "I don't know." But she kept mentioning how things should look, considering the family's reputation. Reputation. It was the same word my mother used when she expanded the guest list, when she upgraded the catering, when she divided the seating chart into tiers of importance. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Sam searched my face. "Are you okay?" I almost said yes automatically. Instead, I surprised both of us by answering honestly. "I don't know." That afternoon, I stayed longer than necessary at the venue, walking through the ballroom alone after everyone else had left. The space was half assembled, tables set but not fully dressed, floral arrangements waiting in buckets, lighting rigs still being adjusted. It felt suspended in time, like it hadn't decided yet what kind of story it was going to tell. That's when I heard Vanessa's voice. It drifted from the preparation room down the hall, sharp and amused. "She should be grateful I'm stepping in," she said, laughing lightly. "Without Mom and me, this wedding would look cheap. Can you imagine what people would think? They'd assume we're poor." I stopped walking. The words didn't shock me. Not really. Vanessa had always equated worth with presentation. But hearing it said so casually, so confidently about my wedding, my life, felt different. "I mean, she grew up in that tiny wooden house with Dad," Vanessa continued. "She doesn't understand how these things work." I felt my hands begin to tremble. The tiny wooden house. I could see it in my mind instantly, the chipped white paint, the sagging porch step my father kept promising to fix, the kitchen table where we ate spaghetti on Sundays because it was affordable and comforting. That house wasn't glamorous. It didn't impress anyone. But it held every memory of stability I had. And here she was, reducing it to a punchline. I didn't step into the room. I didn't confront her. For 30 years, confrontation had never been my instinct. Instead, I stood there in the hallway, listening. "She's lucky we're elevating this," Vanessa said. "Otherwise, it would reflect badly on all of us." Reflect badly. The narrative had been clear all along. My existence had always been something to manage, to polish, to compensate for. I turned and walked away quietly. That silence felt different from the silence I had carried as a child. Back then, silence meant endurance. It meant swallowing discomfort to preserve fragile connections. But standing in that hallway, something inside me shifted. This wasn't endurance anymore. It was awareness. That night, Daniel found me sitting at our kitchen counter long after midnight, staring at nothing. He didn't ask immediately. He just poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from me. "I heard her," I said finally. He didn't need clarification. "She thinks she's saving the wedding," I continued, my voice steadier than I expected. "Saving us from embarrassment." 8. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You are not an embarrassment." "I know that," I replied softly. And for the first time in my life, I realized I meant it. That was new. For years, part of me had wondered if maybe they were right. If maybe I was less polished, less impressive, less worthy. But sitting there in our small kitchen, the one Daniel and I had chosen together, I felt something unfamiliar. Certainty. "I'm done apologizing for where I came from," I said quietly. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means if they cross the line again, I won't protect them from the consequences." His eyes held mine, measuring the shift. "You won't have to do it alone." The morning of the wedding arrived calm and deceptively beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the hotel suite windows as hair and makeup artists moved around me. Laughter echoed softly from my bridesmaids. On the surface, it looked like any other bride's morning. But inside, I felt clear. Not angry, not anxious, clear. When I arrived at the venue and stepped into the ballroom, the division was unmistakable. On one side, my mother's additions were unmistakably extravagant silk tablecloths, towering imported flowers, gold-rimmed glassware. On the other side, the decor reflected the elegance Daniel and I had chosen, simpler, warmer, intentionally understated. It looked like two different events sharing the same roof. Guests began to notice. I overheard whispers, subtle glances, questions asked in polite tones. Why does that side look different? I smiled diplomatically. Different tastes, I replied. But internally, I was observing. For 30 years, my family had operated on image, on maintaining appearances, on ensuring that no one saw the cracks beneath the marble surface. Today, the cracks were visible, and I no longer felt responsible for hiding them. As the ceremony approached, I caught a glimpse of my father standing near the entrance. He looked slightly overwhelmed in his simple suit, adjusting his tie nervously. When he saw me, his face softened into a smile that carried no judgment, no expectation, just pride. In that moment, the contrast became painfully clear. One side of the room was curated, the other was authentic. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't ashamed of where I stood. I didn't know exactly how the evening would unfold. I didn't know that a microphone would become a weapon. I didn't know that Daniel's calm would dismantle decades of carefully constructed hierarchy. But I knew one thing with certainty. If humiliation came again, it would not be met with silence. Not this time. The ceremony itself was beautiful. That's the part people expect when they hear my story, the romance, the vows, the music swelling at exactly the right moment. And yes, when I walked down the aisle and saw Daniel waiting for me, everything else blurred. For a few sacred minutes, there were no divided tables, no whispered judgments, no ghosts of childhood standing between us. There was only his steady gaze and the quiet certainty that I had chosen well. My father walked me down the aisle with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from emotion. I could feel his pride radiating beside me. When he placed my hand into Daniel's, he squeezed my fingers in a way that said more than words ever could. In that moment, I wasn't the poor side of the family. I was simply a daughter loved without condition. The vows were simple and honest. Daniel promised to stand beside me, not in front of me and not behind me. I promised to build a life with him rooted in truth, not performance. The guests applauded. Cameras flashed. On the surface, everything was flawless. It was during the cocktail hour that the fractures began to show. As guests mingled, I noticed the visual divide in the ballroom even more clearly. My mother's side shimmered with deliberate opulence, silk linens, elaborate centerpieces imported from overseas, servers circulating with premium champagne. On my side, the decor was warm and elegant but restrained, reflecting the choices Daniel and I had made together. The contrast wasn't subtle. It looked like two different families hosting two different events in one room. An elderly woman I didn't recognize approached me with a polite smile. "Dear," she said gently, "why does one side look like a gala and the other like a wedding?" I laughed softly, deflecting. Different tastes. But inside, something hardened. Vanessa floated between tables like a hostess overseeing a production. I watched her lean toward a group of my mother's friends, whispering something that made them chuckle behind manicured hands. When she caught my eye, she smiled, sweet, composed, unbothered. Then the speeches began. The best man spoke first. Daniel's brother told stories about college pranks and late-night coding marathons. The room relaxed. Laughter came easily. My maid of honor followed with a heartfelt tribute to resilience and independence. I felt tears prick my eyes as she described how hard I had worked to build everything on my own. For a moment, I believed we might make it through the evening without incident. Then, Vanessa stood up. She hadn't been scheduled to speak. I saw her heels click confidently against the marble floor as she approached the stage. She picked up the microphone before anyone could object. There was no hesitation in her posture, no doubt in her expression. "Surprise?" she announced brightly. I couldn't let tonight pass without saying a few words about my big sister. The room quieted instantly. She began with nostalgia, childhood memories, shared holidays, the unique journey our family had taken after the divorce. Her tone was warm, almost affectionate, but I could feel the shift building beneath the surface, like pressure accumulating before a storm. After the divorce, she continued, our lives went in very different directions. I stayed with Mom. Brianna went with Dad. A few guests nodded sympathetically. She grew up in that tiny wooden house, Vanessa said lightly, glancing toward my father. No lavish parties, no fancy vacations. While I was, well, let's just say I was lucky. There were a few uncertain laughs. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine. Vanessa paused just long enough to ensure everyone was listening. Then she delivered the line that would replay in my mind for weeks. But look at her now. The poor side of the family finally looks presentable. The silence that followed was suffocating. 204 guests, and not a single fork clinked against a plate. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Heat rushed to my face. My first instinct was to shrink, to smile politely, to pretend it was harmless humor. That had been my survival tactic for 3 decades. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of the hallway 2 nights earlier, hearing her call my wedding cheap. Maybe it was the sight of my father sitting upright in his chair, shoulders stiff. Maybe it was Daniel's promise echoing in my mind. If they cross the line, I won't stay silent. Before I could stand, Daniel was already on his feet. He didn't storm the stage. He didn't snatch the microphone. He walked calmly, deliberately, as though this were part of the program. The room watched him with collective anticipation. Vanessa faltered for the first time. Daniel extended his hand. She hesitated, then surrendered the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her. His composure was almost unsettling in its steadiness. Thank you, Vanessa, he began, for reminding us where Brianna came from. The room held its breath. That tiny wooden house you mentioned, he continued, is where she learned integrity. It's where she learned how to build something from nothing. It's where she discovered that love isn't measured by square footage. A murmur rippled through the guests. Daniel glanced toward my father. 3 years ago, when her father was about to lose that house, Brianna paid off every debt without telling anyone. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because family matters to her. I saw my mother's face drain of color. She built her company from scratch, Daniel went on. Over 200 weddings in 5 years, high-profile clients, awards, respect, and she did it without ever asking for a dime from anyone. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Tonight, he said quietly, the only thing that would make someone look poor is a lack of kindness. The applause started hesitantly, then grew stronger. Vanessa's confident smile had vanished. My mother sat frozen, her carefully curated composure cracking at the edges. But the moment wasn't finished. My father stood next. He rarely spoke in large groups. Public attention made him uncomfortable. Yet he rose slowly, his voice trembling but resolute. Brianna never talks about what she's done for me, he said. She saved my home. She saved me. Everything she has, she earned. Tears blurred my vision. I realized then that humiliation had shifted direction. Not because we had attacked in return, but because truth had replaced performance. When Daniel returned to my side, he didn't look triumphant. He looked protective. Are you okay? He whispered. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. For the first time in my life, I hadn't been the one absorbing the blow alone. For the first time, someone had stepped forward not to fight, but to correct the narrative. Vanessa sat down slowly, her earlier poise gone. My mother avoided my eyes. The reception continued, but the energy had changed. Conversations were softer, laughter was more cautious. The illusion of perfection had cracked. And standing there in my wedding dress, I understood something profound. For 30 years, I had allowed myself to believe that silence was strength. But strength, I was beginning to see, could also look like truth spoken calmly in a room full of witnesses. And that night, the truth had finally found its microphone. After the applause faded and the music cautiously resumed, the reception continued, but it no longer felt like the same room. Something invisible had shifted. The carefully maintained hierarchy that had shaped my family for decades had cracked in front of 204 witnesses, and there was no graceful way to pretend it hadn't. People tried, of course. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. A few guests leaned toward my mother with tight smiles, murmuring something about misunderstandings. Others avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly very interested in their wine glasses. Daniel's hand remained at the small of my back, as if he could feel the emotional aftershock still vibrating through me. Vanessa didn't look at me. She sat rigid in her chair, fingers wrapped around a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from. The polished composure she had walked onto that stage with was gone. In its place was something raw, something unsettled. My mother leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but I couldn't hear the words. For a moment, I considered leaving it there, letting the truth stand without further confrontation, letting the evening end on that quiet reversal. But then Vanessa stood again, not with the same confidence as before. This time her steps were unsteady, her breathing uneven. She didn't return to the stage. She walked toward me directly. The room felt like it was holding its breath all over again. "Brianna," she said, her voice low but strained. "I didn't mean it like that." I studied her face. For years, I had memorized the expressions she used when she wanted to win charm, subtle superiority, rehearsed warmth. This was different. Her eyes were glassy, her mascara slightly smudged. The audience of strangers had stripped something from her too. "Then how did you mean it?" I asked calmly. She opened her mouth, closed it, then glanced toward our mother, as if searching for direction. That alone told me more than her words ever could. Mom stepped in quickly. "Vanessa was just joking. You know how she is. Don't turn this into something it's not. Don't turn this into something it's not." For 30 years, that sentence or some version of it had been used to shrink my reactions, to redefine hurt as oversensitivity, to smooth over imbalance in the name of peace. But tonight, I didn't feel the urge to shrink. "It already is something," I replied quietly. Vanessa's composure cracked further. Her shoulders began to shake, and then, unexpectedly, she started crying. Not the controlled, elegant kind of crying that wins sympathy. This was messy, unguarded. "Mom promised no one would ever know," she whispered hoarsely. The words hit me harder than the insult had. "No what?" I asked. She pressed her face into our mother's shoulder, as if realizing too late that she had said too much. Mom's grip on her tightened. "Not here," she said sharply. But it was too late. The air between us had thickened with something unsaid. The rest of the reception passed in a strange blur. The cake was cut. The first dance happened. People clapped and smiled and tried to salvage the mood. Yet the polished image my mother had curated for decades had fractured publicly, and no imported flower arrangement could disguise it. Several of her friends left early, citing long drives or early mornings. Richard remained polite but distant, his smile no longer reaching his eyes. Vanessa's boyfriend sat at the edge of his table, posture stiff, as though he had just witnessed a version of her he hadn't known existed. Through it all, I felt surprisingly calm. Not triumphant, not vindicated. Just steady. After the final guests drifted out and the ballroom staff began dismantling centerpieces, I stepped outside into the garden behind the venue. The night air was cool against my skin, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. Footsteps approached behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was my mother. When she reached me, she didn't stand as close as usual. There was hesitation in her posture, uncertainty in her silence. The woman who commanded rooms effortlessly now seemed smaller, almost fragile. "Brianna," she began softly, "we need to talk." I didn't respond. I simply waited. She drew in a slow breath. "There are things you don't understand. About the divorce. About why I made certain choices." The word choices felt deliberate. "When I married Richard," she continued, "his family made it clear they didn't want complications. 2 children were complicated." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "They said 1 child would be acceptable," she said, her voice tightening. "The younger one. Easier to integrate, easier to shape." I swallowed hard. I had always known, in a vague way, that the custody arrangement wasn't purely logistical, but hearing it framed so bluntly stripped away the illusion of fairness. "I thought you were stronger," she went on. "You had your father, you were independent. Vanessa was so little. I told myself you would be okay. You would be okay." 3 words that had defined my childhood. "But after 2 years," she continued, "they changed their minds about Vanessa. They wanted to send her away to boarding school. Across the country." Richard agreed with them. I looked at her sharply. "I fought them," she insisted. "For months. I was terrified every day that she would be taken from me. I overcompensated. I gave her everything. I made her the center of my world because I was afraid of losing her." "And me?" I asked quietly. She closed her eyes. "You seemed fine," she whispered. There it was again. The assumption that my strength meant I needed less. "I wasn't fine," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I was quiet." Tears streamed down her face now. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just exhausted. "I was ashamed," she admitted. "Every time I looked at you, I saw your father. I saw the life I walked away from. It was easier to focus on Vanessa than to face that." The truth hung heavy between us. Understanding does not erase pain. It does not undo missed birthdays or unanswered calls or years of feeling secondary. But it does change the shape of the wound. "I understand your fear," I said slowly, "but that doesn't excuse sacrificing me." She nodded, unable to argue. "I won't be treated as less anymore," I continued. "If you want to be part of my life, it has to be with respect, not image, not comparison, respect." She agreed, though I could see uncertainty in her eyes, uncertainty about whether she knew how. When she left the garden, I remained standing there for several minutes. Daniel eventually joined me, wrapping his jacket around my shoulders. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. I thought about the ballroom, about the speech, about the secret that had finally surfaced. "Free," I said. Not because everything was fixed. Not because forgiveness had erased the past. But because, for the first time in 30 years, the story was no longer one-sided. The silence that had protected everyone else at my expense had broken. And once truth enters a room, it refuses to leave quietly. That night, as we drove away from the venue, I realized something fundamental. The humiliation wasn't the turning point. The turning point was no longer believing I deserved it. The morning after the wedding felt unreal. For months, everything had been building toward one night, one ceremony, one reception, one moment where all the invisible lines in my family were drawn in bright light. And then, suddenly, it was over. The dress hung over a chair in our hotel suite, slightly wrinkled at the hem. My bouquet sat in a glass of water on the bedside table. The world outside continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted. Daniel was still asleep when I slipped out of bed and walked toward the window. The city looked calm, washed in pale morning light. Cars moved below. People hurried along sidewalks. No one knew that the carefully maintained image my mother had built for 3 decades had cracked open the night before. No one knew that the words, "poor side of the family," had finally lost their power over me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. For a moment, I hesitated. I knew it would start today: reactions, explanations, damage control. I picked it up slowly. The first message was from my maid of honor. "Are you okay? I'm so proud of you." The second was from an old college friend. "Your husband is incredible." Then came a text from Vanessa. It was longer than I expected. "I don't know how to say this," it began. "I've rewritten this message 10 times. I'm sorry. I was cruel. I don't even know why I said it like that. I've spent my whole life terrified of being sent away again. Mom always reminded me how close I came to being shipped off to boarding school. I turned that fear into needing to look perfect, and I made you the comparison because you were safe. You were strong. I was wrong." I read it 3 times. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to resolve everything neatly. But healing doesn't follow a schedule. I placed the phone face down and let the silence sit. Daniel stirred behind me. "You're up early," he murmured. I turned, managing a small smile. I don't think my mind got the memo that the wedding is over. He sat up, studying my expression. Regret anything? I thought about the microphone, about Daniel walking to the stage, about my father standing with trembling hands, about my mother's confession in the garden. No, I said honestly. For the first time, no. We left for a short honeymoon later that afternoon. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet coastal town a few hours away. I had planned luxury events for years. I didn't need spectacle. I needed space. During those days by the ocean, something unexpected happened. Without constant contact from my family, I felt lighter. Daniel and I walked along the shoreline in the mornings, the air salty and cool. We talked about everything except the wedding, at first future plans, travel dreams, whether we wanted a dog, but eventually, the conversation circled back. "Do you think your mom meant it?" he asked one evening as we watched the sunset. "I think she meant what she felt in that moment," I replied. "Fear. And your sister?" I paused. "I think she built her identity around not being abandoned. Being superior was safer than being vulnerable." Daniel nodded slowly. "And you?" I considered that carefully. "I built mine around not needing anyone. Argan here." That realization startled me more than anything my mother had confessed. Strength had become my shield. Independence had been my armor. But armor is heavy, and sometimes, in protecting yourself, you also isolate yourself. A few days into our trip, another message arrived, this time from my mother. Not a text, a photo. It was a picture of the wooden house where I grew up. The porch steps had been repaired, the paint refreshed. My father stood in the frame, smiling awkwardly as if he wasn't sure how to pose. Underneath, she had written, "I never thanked you for saving this place. I should have." I stared at the screen for a long time. 3 years earlier, when the bank had threatened foreclosure, I had paid off my father's debts quietly. I hadn't told anyone, not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't feel like something to announce. It was simply what you did when someone you loved needed help. For my mother to acknowledge it now meant she had heard Daniel's words. And my father's. The public narrative had shifted. But acknowledgement is not the same as repair. When we returned home from the honeymoon, life resumed its rhythm. Work emails, vendor calls, normalcy. Yet beneath it all, conversations were happening quietly. Vanessa's boyfriend ended their relationship within a week. He had sent her a brief message. "I didn't know you were capable of humiliating someone like that." The image she had cultivated, confident, untouchable, had fractured in more than one way. Richard grew colder toward my mother, not dramatically, just subtly distant. Secrets that had remained buried for decades now demanded air. One afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived at our door. I recognized my mother's script immediately. I sat at the kitchen table, turning the envelope over in my hands before opening it. The letter was long. She wrote about the divorce, about the pressure from Richard's family, about the months she had spent negotiating to keep Vanessa from being sent away. She admitted something I hadn't fully understood until now. "Every time I looked at you," she wrote, "I saw your father. I saw my own failure. I avoided you because it hurt to face what I had lost. That wasn't your fault. It was mine." The words blurred as I read them. For 30 years, I had believed there was something lacking in me, something that made me less lovable, less worthy of attention. To realize that I had simply been a reminder of her regret felt both devastating and liberating. Daniel found me still at the table when he came home. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. I thought carefully before answering. "Like I've been carrying someone else's shame," I said. "And I'm finally setting it down." Forgiveness didn't arrive in a dramatic wave. It came slowly, cautiously. I wrote back to my mother, not with accusations, but with boundaries. I told her I was willing to rebuild a relationship, but only if it was grounded in respect, not performance, not comparison, not reputation. To Vanessa, I replied with equal honesty. I acknowledged her apology. I told her I understood the fear that shaped her, but I also told her that understanding didn't erase consequences. We began again, not as children locked into roles, but as adults accountable for our choices. A month later, Daniel and I drove to my father's house for dinner. The wooden walls, the simple kitchen, the familiar scent of home-cooked food, it all felt different now. Not small, not lesser, solid. After dinner, Dad raised his glass. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "Not because you proved anyone wrong, but because you stayed kind. Kind. For years, I had mistaken kindness for weakness, but now I saw it differently. Kindness, paired with boundaries, is strength." As I stood by the window that night, looking out at the garden where I used to play as a child, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Justice isn't watching someone else crumble. Justice is realizing you were never the problem. And once you understand that, the words meant to diminish you lose their echo. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the poor side of anything. I felt whole. The weeks after the wedding didn't explode into chaos the way you might expect. There were no viral videos, no public scandals, no dramatic confrontations splashed across social media. On the outside, everything settled quickly. But underneath, quiet shifts were happening, small, deliberate movements that changed the structure of my family more than any shouting ever could. Vanessa was the first to reach out again. Not with a long confession this time. Not with excuses. Just a simple message. "Can we meet? Just the two of us." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. For 30 years, every interaction between us had followed an unspoken script. She performed confidence. I performed indifference. Neither of us acknowledged the imbalance that defined our childhood. Meeting her now meant stepping outside that script. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral territory. She arrived without makeup for once, her hair pulled back casually. The absence of polish startled me more than any insult ever had. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things: the weather, traffic, work, the way strangers do when they're circling something heavier. Then she looked at me directly. "I was awful," she said simply. There was no defensiveness in her voice this time. No theatrical guilt. Just exhaustion. "I spent my whole life thinking if I wasn't perfect, I'd lose everything," she continued. "Mom never let me forget how close I came to being sent away. I turned that fear into superiority. It felt safer." I listened, without interrupting. "I needed to believe I was better," she admitted. "Because if I wasn't, then why was I chosen?" There it was. The question neither of us had ever said aloud. Why was she chosen? And by implication, why wasn't I? "I didn't think about what that did to you," she said quietly. "I just needed to believe the story made sense." I nodded slowly. "It never made sense to me." She swallowed hard. "When Daniel spoke, when Uncle Mark clapped and people looked at me like I'd done something cruel, I realized I had, and I couldn't hide behind Mom's approval anymore." Her words didn't erase years of comparison. They didn't magically dissolve the memory of standing in my wedding dress while she reduced my life to a punchline, but they felt honest. "I'm not angry," I told her carefully, "but I'm not pretending it didn't happen either." She nodded, accepting that. That conversation didn't transform us into close sisters overnight. It didn't undo decades of subtle competition. But it shifted something fundamental. For the first time, we were speaking as equals, not as the chosen child and the overlooked one. Meanwhile, my mother's attempts at repair were more hesitant. She called more often, though her tone carried uncertainty now. The sharp edges in her voice had softened. She asked about my work, not as a casual aside, but with genuine curiosity. The first time she requested photos from a wedding I had recently planned, I felt a strange mixture of pride and caution. She was trying. But effort doesn't automatically rebuild trust. One evening, she invited Daniel and me to dinner. Not a formal gathering with Richard's associates, just the four of us. The house looked the same: grand, immaculate, curated. But the atmosphere felt different, less performative. During dinner, she asked Daniel about a project he was developing. She listened without interrupting. She asked me about an upcoming event I was coordinating. She didn't critique the venue choice. She didn't suggest upgrades. Small things. Yet to me, they felt enormous. At one point, she set down her fork and looked at me carefully. "I didn't realize how much I minimized you," she said. I thought independence meant you needed less. I met her gaze steadily. Independence isn't the same as not needing love. She absorbed that quietly. Repair, I was learning, doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from repeated, consistent respect. Richard, however, remained distant. The revelation about the boarding school ultimatum had shaken him more than I expected, not because it embarrassed him socially, but because it exposed a secret he hadn't fully understood. His marriage to my mother had been built on compromises he didn't want examined. The foundation of their world, so dependent on appearances, had been disturbed. Vanessa's life was shifting too. Without the constant reinforcement of being the perfect daughter, she seemed unsure of who she was. She began therapy, something she admitted reluctantly. She started questioning the standards she had internalized: status, wealth, image. "I don't even know what I like," she confessed once over coffee. "I've always chosen what would look impressive." I understood that feeling more than she realized. For years, I had chosen silence because it looked strong. I had mistaken endurance for dignity. The biggest shift, though, happened within me. For the first time in my life, I stopped replaying old conversations at night. I stopped dissecting every childhood memory to find proof of my inadequacy. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently to earn my mother's attention. Because I finally understood something essential. It was never about earning. It was about fear. My mother feared losing control. Vanessa feared losing security. And I had feared losing connection. Each of us had been reacting to the same fracture in different ways. One afternoon, I visited my father alone. We sat at the small kitchen table where I had once done homework while waiting for phone calls that didn't come. "You okay?" he asked gently. "I am," I said, and meant it. He studied me for a moment. "You know, I never thought you were less than anyone." I smiled. "I know that now." That house, the one Vanessa had mocked, no longer felt like a symbol of comparison. It felt like proof of something else entirely: stability, consistency, love without conditions. The narrative of my childhood had changed. Not because the past was rewritten, but because I stopped seeing myself through someone else's lens. Months after the wedding, when I walked into another ballroom to coordinate yet another couple's ceremony, I felt different. Stronger, yes, but not armored. There's a difference. Armor protects you by hardening you. Strength allows you to stay soft without breaking. When brides confided their family tensions to me, I listened with deeper understanding. When mothers tried to overtake decisions, I recognized the pattern immediately. I guided conversations gently but firmly. I no longer confused control with care. Looking back now, the wedding wasn't just a turning point for my family. It was a turning point for me. The insult that once would have shattered me instead revealed something important. I was never the poor side of anything. I was the side that learned resilience without cruelty. And once you see your own worth clearly, no microphone, no matter how loud, can redefine it for you. If you had told me a year ago that the most important relationship I would rebuild after my wedding wouldn't be with my mother or my sister, but with myself, I wouldn't have understood what you meant. For most of my life, I thought my greatest strength was endurance. I was the daughter who didn't demand attention, the sister who didn't compete, the woman who built success quietly and carried disappointment without making noise. I wore that identity like a badge of honor. It made me feel morally superior in a subtle way. I didn't need luxury. I didn't need validation. I didn't need applause. At least that's what I told myself. But the truth is, independence can sometimes be a disguise. A way of saying, if I don't expect anything, I can't be hurt. And I had spent 30 years lowering my expectations in order to protect myself from rejection. After the wedding, once the conversations with my mother and Vanessa had begun, and the immediate shock had faded, I found myself facing a quieter question. Who am I when I'm not trying to prove something? I didn't have an immediate answer. In the weeks that followed, I returned fully to work. Another bride, another ballroom, another meticulously planned celebration. Normally, coordinating events grounded me. Logistics were predictable. Emotions could be managed with timelines and backup plans. But this time, I noticed something new. I wasn't shrinking in rooms anymore. At a vendor meeting one afternoon, a supplier tried to override a design decision I had made. In the past, I might have softened my response, turned it into a compromise to avoid tension. This time, I held my ground calmly. "This is the client's vision," I said, "and it's mine to execute." There was no apology in my tone, no defensive explanation, just certainty. Driving home that evening, I realized something subtle but profound. I wasn't speaking from insecurity anymore. I wasn't overcompensating. I wasn't trying to appear agreeable so no one would see me as difficult. I was simply taking up space. That shift carried into my personal life too. When my mother called and began to comment lightly, almost habitually on how busy I seemed, I gently redirected the conversation. "I like being busy," I told her. "It's something I chose." It wasn't confrontational. But it was clear. Boundaries, I was learning, don't have to be loud to be firm. Vanessa's journey unfolded more unevenly. Without the constant validation she had grown accustomed to, she seemed unsteady at first. She began therapy, something she mentioned almost defensively during one of our coffees. "I don't want to be that person," she said, "the one who needs to feel better than everyone else." I didn't respond with reassurance. I didn't tell her she was already better. Growth requires discomfort. I let the silence sit until she filled it with something more honest. "I don't actually know who I am without Mom's approval," she admitted quietly. Her confession mirrored something I had wrestled with myself. Who was I, without striving for someone else's recognition, without silently measuring my worth against a childhood narrative? Healing, I realized, wasn't about flipping roles. It wasn't about becoming the superior one. It was about dismantling the hierarchy altogether. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and I drove back to my father's house for dinner. The wooden porch creaked under our steps the way it always had. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and the tomato sauce he was simmering inside. While Daniel helped him in the kitchen, I walked through the house slowly. The narrow hallway, the slightly uneven floorboards, the small living room where I used to study late into the night. Nothing about it looked impressive, but everything about it felt stable. For years, I had subconsciously compared this place to my mother's sprawling estate, measured it against marble countertops and high ceilings. Even if I never said it aloud, a part of me had internalized that difference. Now, standing there, I felt something else entirely. Gratitude. Not the forced kind, the grounded kind. This house had given me consistency. It had given me a father who showed up. It had given me space to grow without performance. Later, after dinner, my father and I sat on the back porch. The sky was turning soft pink as the sun dipped lower. "You don't carry it the same way anymore," he said suddenly. "Carry what?" I asked. "The weight," he replied. I thought about that. For years, I had carried a quiet heaviness, the sense that I needed to earn my place, that my worth was conditional. That love required proof. "I think I finally realized something," I said slowly. "I was never less than. I was just looking at myself through someone else's insecurity." He nodded, as if he had known that all along. That night, as Daniel and I drove home, I rested my head against the seat and allowed myself to feel something unfamiliar. Ease. Not because everything was perfect. My relationship with my mother remained cautious. Vanessa and I were still rebuilding carefully, one honest conversation at a time. There were still moments when old instincts flared, when I wanted to minimize, to retreat, to overachieve in order to reassure myself. But those moments no longer controlled me. One evening, a few months later, I received an invitation to speak at a professional event about building a business from scratch. In the past, I might have hesitated, worrying about whether I sounded impressive enough, whether my story was significant enough. This time, I accepted without overthinking it. Standing on that stage weeks later, I didn't talk about wealth or prestige. I talked about resilience, about learning to create stability when it isn't handed to you, about understanding that quiet strength is still strength. Afterward, a young woman approached me. "You make it sound like it's okay to not come from money," she said softly. "It is okay," I replied. "It's more than okay." Driving home that night, I thought about the microphone at my wedding, about how a single sentence meant to diminish me had instead revealed something essential. I had spent 30 years believing I needed to prove I wasn't the poor side. But poverty was never about square footage or table linens. It was about scarcity of kindness, scarcity of empathy, scarcity of self-worth. And I was no longer living in scarcity. The most unexpected outcome of that night wasn't public validation. It wasn't watching my mother's composure crack or hearing applause after Daniel spoke. It was the quiet realization, months later, that I no longer introduced myself internally as the overlooked daughter. I introduced myself as someone whole, not because others had finally seen me, but because I had finally seen myself. And once you reach that place, the past loses its grip. The insult fades. The comparison dissolves. And what remains is something far more powerful than revenge: peace. If there was one thing I didn't expect after the wedding, it was how quiet the aftermath would feel. I had imagined, in my darker moments, some dramatic unraveling, confrontations, raised voices, doors slamming. Instead, what followed was something far subtler and, in many ways, far more unsettling. Silence. Reflection. The slow recognition that the story my family had been telling for decades could no longer hold its shape. A week after the honeymoon, I received another message from my mother. This time it wasn't defensive or explanatory. It was short. "Can we talk again? Properly." There was something different in her wording. No justification, no attempt to manage perception, just a request. We met at her house on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The same house that had once felt so imposing now seemed strangely smaller. Or maybe I was simply standing differently within it. She didn't greet me with air kisses or polished small talk. She led me straight to the sitting room and closed the door behind us. "I've been thinking about what you said in the garden," she began. "About respect." I didn't interrupt. "I always told myself I had to choose the child who needed me more," she continued. "But I see now that what I really did was choose the child who made me feel less guilty." The admission landed heavily. "For years," she said, her voice thinning, "every time I looked at you, I was reminded of your father, of the life I walked away from. I convinced myself you were better off without me, because that was easier than admitting I failed you." Failed. It was a word she had never used before. "I didn't know how to love you without feeling shame," she whispered. Hearing it framed that way didn't erase the birthdays she missed. It didn't soften the years of comparison. But it reframed something fundamental. The absence had not been about my inadequacy. It had been about her inability to confront her own choices. "I needed you to be strong," she said, "so I didn't have to face how weak I was." I sat quietly, absorbing the weight of that. Strength had always been my assigned role. The independent one. The low-maintenance one. The daughter who didn't require extra reassurance. It had felt like a compliment for years. Now I saw it differently. Being labeled strong had been permission for neglect. "I was strong because I had to be," I replied calmly. "Not because I didn't need you." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't feel performative. They felt raw. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I'm not withholding it," I answered honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened." She nodded slowly. We spoke for hours that afternoon. About the divorce. About Richard's family and their pressure to maintain a certain image. About the boarding school threat that had terrified her into overcompensating with Vanessa. About how she had mistaken protection for favoritism. It wasn't a clean conversation. There were pauses. Long silences. Moments where neither of us knew what to say next. But it was real. When I left that day, I didn't feel lighter in the dramatic sense. I felt grounded, like something unstable had finally been acknowledged instead of avoided. Vanessa's journey continued alongside mine. She invited me to attend one of her therapy sessions as part of a family dynamic discussion. I hesitated at first. Sitting in a room with her, dissecting decades of comparison, felt daunting. But I agreed. The therapist asked simple questions that carried complicated answers. "When did you first feel you were competing?" she asked Vanessa. Vanessa glanced at me before responding. "I don't remember competing," she said slowly. "I remember being told I was chosen." Chosen. The word hung in the air. "And how did that make you feel?" the therapist continued. Safe, Vanessa admitted, but also terrified. Terrified of what? That if I stopped being impressive, I'd lose that choice. For the first time, I saw her not as the confident, untouchable sister I had grown up envying, but as someone carrying a different version of the same wound. She had been chosen, but the choice had come with conditions. I had been overlooked, but my independence had been unconditional. Both roles had shaped us in ways neither of us fully understood until now. Later that week, Daniel and I hosted my father for dinner at our apartment. It was simple pasta, salad, a bottle of wine, nothing extravagant. Yet the warmth in that small space felt richer than any gala I had ever organized. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. I was afraid that night, he admitted quietly, when she said what she said. Why? I asked. I thought you'd believe her, he said. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For years, he continued, I worried you might look at our life and think it wasn't enough. I reached across the table and took his hand. It was more than enough, I said firmly. It was real. He smiled then, relief softening his features. Driving him home later, I realized something profound. The humiliation at the wedding hadn't just exposed my mother's fear or Vanessa's insecurity. It had exposed my own lingering doubt, a quiet question that had followed me since childhood. Was I somehow less because I grew up without wealth? That question no longer had power. A month after the wedding, I received an unexpected invitation. A local nonprofit organization wanted me to help plan a charity event focused on supporting children from divorced families. When I asked why they chose me, the coordinator replied, We heard your story, and we think your perspective matters. It's take 7. Perspective. For years, I had hidden parts of my story to avoid seeming resentful. Now, those same experiences were becoming something I could use to help others. At the event, I spoke briefly about resilience, about how children internalize choices they never made, about how being the strong one doesn't mean you don't need support. Afterward, a young woman approached me. My parents divorced when I was little, she said quietly. I always thought I was the problem. It is. You weren't, I replied without hesitation, because now, I knew that truth intimately. Months passed. The tension that had once defined every interaction with my family softened into something more balanced. Not perfect, not entirely healed, but honest. My mother made consistent efforts, showing up to my work events, asking about my projects without comparison. Vanessa continued therapy, learning to untangle her identity from performance. And me? I stopped narrating my life through the lens of what I lacked. I started seeing it through what I built. The tiny wooden house that had once been framed as evidence of poverty became, in my mind, evidence of perseverance, of unconditional love, of stability that didn't depend on reputation. Looking back now, I don't see the wedding as the moment my sister humiliated me. I see it as the moment the illusion cracked, the illusion that wealth equals worth, the illusion that being chosen makes you superior, the illusion that silence protects you. What replaced those illusions wasn't revenge. It was clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is far more powerful than any perfectly delivered insult. Because once you understand that you were never the problem, you stop trying to fix yourself to fit someone else's fear. And that is where true freedom begins. In the months that followed the wedding, I began to notice something subtle but powerful. The past no longer arrived in my mind like an accusation. It arrived like a chapter I had already read. For years, certain memories had felt sharp. The scholarship phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes. The way my mother's voice brightened only when she mentioned Vanessa's achievements. The Christmas mornings where gifts were unevenly extravagant. The way I learned to say, "It's okay," before anyone even asked if I was hurt. Those memories used to replay like evidence in a courtroom where I was both the defendant and the judge. I would analyze them late at night, asking myself what I could have done differently. Could I have been more charming, more impressive, less sensitive? After the wedding, those questions began to fade. Not because the memories disappeared, but because their meaning changed. Understanding my mother's fear did not excuse her behavior, but it reframed it. She hadn't loved me less because I was lacking. She had avoided me because I reminded her of choices she regretted. Her absence had been about her own shame, not my inadequacy. That distinction altered everything. Daniel noticed the shift before I articulated it. One evening, as we were cooking dinner together, he paused and studied me. "You don't flinch anymore when she calls," he observed. I laughed softly. "I guess I stopped expecting something from her that she never promised." "That sounds sad," he said gently. "It's not," I replied. "It's realistic, and realism can be freeing." The truth was, I had spent decades trying to earn a version of my mother that only existed in my imagination. The attentive parent, the proud supporter, the unconditional encourager. Once I stopped chasing that fantasy, I found myself standing on firmer ground. Vanessa and I continued meeting occasionally. Our conversations were less guarded now. She no longer spoke from a pedestal. She spoke from uncertainty. "I always thought you didn't care," she admitted once over coffee. "You seemed so unaffected." I smiled at that. I cared a lot. I just didn't show it. Why? Because showing it never changed anything. She absorbed that quietly. For the first time, we were both acknowledging that our childhood roles had been costumes we wore for survival. She had played the golden child to secure her place. I had played the independent one to protect myself from disappointment. Neither role had allowed room for vulnerability. Therapy was helping her untangle those patterns. Boundaries were helping me untangle mine. One afternoon, my mother asked to visit my office. It was the first time she had stepped into a space I built entirely on my own. As she walked through the entryway past framed photos of past weddings, awards displayed modestly along the wall, I watched her carefully. "This is impressive," she said softly. There was no backhanded compliment this time. No comparison. "Thank you," I replied, resisting the urge to downplay it. She lingered by a photo of a rustic outdoor ceremony I had designed. "You always had good taste," she murmured. The comment surprised me. Growing up, my choices had often been framed as simple compared to Vanessa's refined style. Hearing my mother acknowledge my aesthetic without correction felt like a small but meaningful shift. "I'm proud of you," she added after a moment. The words were late, decades late, but they were real. And here is something I never expected to say. They mattered. Not because I needed them to validate my worth anymore, but because they marked a change, an effort, a recognition that had once felt impossible. Still, I didn't let those words erase the past. Growth is not about pretending the wound never existed. It's about choosing not to reopen it unnecessarily. My father, in his quiet way, remained my steady reference point. One evening, while we were sitting on his porch, he said something that stayed with me. "You know," he began, staring out at the yard, "I used to worry that you'd resent me for not giving you what she did." And a very plain, "What do you mean?" I asked. "The big house, the vacations, the appearance." I smiled gently. "You gave me something she couldn't." "What's that?" "Consistency." He nodded slowly, as though he had never framed it that way. Consistency doesn't sparkle, it doesn't impress dinner guests, but it builds something far more durable than image: trust. The more I reflected, the more I realized that my so-called disadvantage had shaped strengths I wouldn't trade. I learned early how to build stability from scratch, how to make careful financial decisions, how to navigate rooms without relying on pedigree, how to read emotional undercurrents because I had spent years managing them. The wedding had not been my revenge. It had been my revelation. Months later, at another event I was coordinating, I found myself watching a bride argue gently with her mother over seating arrangements. The mother insisted on placing certain business associates at the front. The bride wanted her college friends there instead. I stepped in not to choose sides, but to guide the conversation. "This day should reflect who you are," I told the bride calmly. "Not who you're trying to impress." As I said the words, I realized I was speaking to my younger self as much as to her. That night, driving home, I felt something settle permanently within me. The old narrative, the one where I was slightly less, slightly overlooked, slightly behind, no longer surfaced automatically. Instead, when I thought of my childhood, I saw two girls shaped by the same fracture in different ways. One who clung to approval, one who clung to independence, neither inherently better, neither inherently worse. Just human. The humiliation at my wedding had forced everything into the open. It had stripped away polite illusions and exposed uncomfortable truths. But it had also given me something invaluable: clarity. Clarity about my mother's limitations. Clarity about my sister's fear. Clarity about my own resilience. And perhaps most importantly, clarity about worth. Worth is not measured by guest lists or silk tablecloths. It is not determined by which parent you lived with or how many rooms your childhood home had. It is not secured by being chosen over someone else. Worth is intrinsic. It exists before comparison ever begins. For years, I believed I needed to prove that I wasn't the poor side. Now I understand that the label itself was meaningless. Poverty of kindness, poverty of self-awareness, poverty of accountability. Those are the only scarcities that truly matter. And I no longer live in scarcity. If someone were to stand in front of 204 guests today and try to define me with a single sentence, it would not pierce the way it once did. Because I know who I am. Not the overlooked daughter. Not the strong one who needed less. Not the poor side of anything. Just Brianna. And that is finally enough. There was a time, not long ago, when I believed the hardest part of my story was the humiliation itself. Standing in a white dress while my sister reduced my childhood to a joke in front of 204 guests. Hearing the words, "poor side of the family," echo through a room I had worked so hard to fill with love. Watching my father sit there, shoulders stiff, absorbing the insult quietly the way he had absorbed so much of life. But as the months passed, I began to understand something deeper. The hardest part wasn't what she said. It was how long I had believed some version of it. For 30 years, I carried a quiet suspicion that maybe I was slightly less polished, less impressive, less deserving of the spotlight. I told myself I didn't care, that independence was my strength, that not needing approval made me superior in its own way. But beneath that, pride was a small, unspoken question. Why wasn't I chosen? After the wedding, once the conversations had unfolded and the truths had surfaced, that question finally began to dissolve. Not because someone handed me validation, but because I saw clearly that the choice had never been about worth. It had been about fear. My mother had chosen Vanessa because she was younger, more malleable, easier to integrate into the world she was trying to build with Richard. Later, when Richard's family threatened to send Vanessa away, my mother overcorrected. She poured attention into her. She built her into proof that she was still a good mother. And in doing so, she convinced herself that I was strong enough not to need the same care. Strong enough. I used to wear that label like armor. Now I see it for what it was, an assumption that allowed neglect to look reasonable. One evening, a few months after the wedding, Daniel and I were sitting on our couch, scrolling through old photos from the reception. There was one of my father wiping his eyes during the ceremony, one of Daniel holding the microphone with steady composure, one of me standing between them, not crying, not shrinking, just present. "You look different here," Daniel said quietly. "How?" I asked. "Like you're not trying to hold everything together anymore." He was right. For most of my life, I had been the emotional shock absorber, the one who smoothed tension, who minimized discomfort, who translated criticism into something easier to swallow. That night, when Daniel spoke and my father stood up and the truth spilled into the open, I stopped absorbing. I let the truth exist without cushioning it. That shift continued to ripple outward. Vanessa and I had another long conversation weeks later, this time at her apartment. It was less dramatic than the cafe meeting, more reflective. She showed me photos from childhood vacations I hadn't attended, birthdays I hadn't shared. "I used to think you didn't want to be there," she admitted softly. "I wasn't invited," I replied gently. She winced. "I thought Mom would include you if it mattered," she said. "That's the thing," I answered. "It always mattered." We sat with that silence for a while. "I built my identity around being chosen," she said eventually. "You built yours around not needing to be." The symmetry of it startled me. Both of us had shaped ourselves around a fracture we didn't create. Neither of us had been the villain. Neither of us had been entirely innocent. We had simply adapted differently. In the months that followed, my mother's efforts remained steady but imperfect. She attended one of my corporate events unannounced, standing quietly in the back as I directed a room of 200 guests. When it ended, she approached me not with critique, but with admiration. "You command a room," she said. "I learned from watching you," I replied honestly. The truth was, I had learned from both of them. From her composure, from Vanessa's confidence, from my father's steadiness. For years, I had framed my childhood as a story of disadvantage. Now I saw it as a mosaic of influences, not balanced, not always fair, but formative. The biggest transformation, though, was internal. One night, lying awake beside Daniel, I found myself replaying the moment of humiliation not to analyze it, but to observe my reaction to it now. The memory no longer tightened my chest. It felt distant, almost instructive. If that moment had happened 5 years earlier, I would have internalized it. I would have questioned whether there was truth buried in the insult. I would have quietly resolved to work harder, to be more impressive, to erase the label. Instead, I had stood there and felt something entirely new: clarity. The insult said more about the person delivering it than about me. That realization changed how I moved through the world. At work, I no longer over-explained my decisions to reassure clients. In social settings, I stopped downplaying my achievements to avoid seeming boastful. With my family, I spoke directly when something felt dismissive. Not aggressively, just clearly. A few weeks later, my father and I were sitting on his porch again. The evening air carried the scent of rain. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" I asked him. He considered that for a moment. "Of course," he said, "but I don't wish you were different." The simplicity of that answer settled something deep inside me. For years, I had equated being overlooked with being unwanted. But my father had never wavered. His love had been consistent, uncomplicated, unconditional, and that foundation had shaped me more than any mansion ever could. Looking back now, I see the wedding not as a climax of cruelty, but as a catalyst for truth. It forced conversations that might never have happened. It stripped away illusions that had quietly governed our family dynamic. It revealed insecurities that had been disguised as confidence. And it confronted me with the most important realization of all. I was never trying to prove I wasn't poor. I was trying to prove I was enough. The difference between those two motivations is everything. When you try to prove you're not poor, you chase external validation, money, status, applause. When you realize you are enough, you stop chasing altogether. Today, if someone were to ask me about that night, I don't recount it as a story of humiliation. I tell it as the moment I stopped mistaking silence for strength, as the moment my husband's calm voice interrupted decades of imbalance, as the moment my father's trembling honesty reframed an entire childhood. Most importantly, I tell it as the moment I stopped believing I had to earn love by being less demanding. The poor side of the family turned out to be the side that knew how to build from scratch, the side that understood loyalty without spectacle, the side that survived without needing to diminish anyone else. And once you understand that your worth was never up for negotiation, no microphone, no insult, no carefully curated image can take it from you. Because it was never theirs to define in the first place. There was one more conversation that needed to happen before I could truly close that chapter of my life, not with my mother, not with Vanessa, but with the version of myself who had stood in that ballroom believing, even for a second, that she deserved the humiliation. It sounds dramatic to phrase it that way, but it's the truth. The cruelest part of that night wasn't the sentence itself. It was the flicker of recognition I felt when Vanessa said it. The tiny, reflexive thought. Of course she thinks that. Maybe she's right. That reflex had been trained over years. It showed up when my mother cut my scholarship story short to celebrate Vanessa's cheerleading uniform. It showed up when my accomplishments were acknowledged with a polite nod instead of pride. It showed up every time I minimized my own success to avoid appearing competitive. And even after Daniel stood up, even after my father revealed the truth, even after the applause, There was still a quiet part of me asking, why did this affect you so much? Why did you still care? The answer was simple, but uncomfortable. Because I had been trying to earn something that was never meant to be earned. Love, approval, recognition. For most of my life, I told myself I didn't need those things from my mother. I had my father. I had my work. I had independence. But independence, when built from emotional scarcity, can become a form of denial. It took time for me to admit that I had wanted her to clap, that I had wanted her to say, "I'm proud of you," without being prompted. That I had wanted to be chosen not because I was easier to love, but because I was hers. Once I admitted that, something softened inside me. I stopped judging myself for caring. One afternoon, months after the wedding, I was alone in my office reviewing contracts when I found myself staring at an old photo I kept tucked inside a drawer. It was from when I was about 8 years old. I was standing outside the wooden house, missing one front tooth, holding a handmade birthday cake my father had helped me bake. I looked so proud, so certain, so unaware of comparison. And I realized that the child in that photo had not felt poor. She had felt loved. It was only later, after years of subtle hierarchy, that I began measuring my life against someone else's standard. That realization shifted the way I spoke to myself. Instead of asking, "Why wasn't I chosen?" I began asking, "What did I gain from the life I had?" The answer surprised me. I gained resilience without entitlement. I gained the ability to build something from scratch without relying on inherited status. I gained the capacity to navigate rooms where I didn't automatically belong and still command respect. Most importantly, I gained empathy. When I worked with brides who were caught in family tensions, I understood the silent negotiations beneath their smiles. When a father hesitated before giving a speech, I noticed the weight in his voice. When a sibling dynamic felt strained, I recognized the undercurrents immediately. My childhood hadn't diminished me. It had sharpened me. That doesn't romanticize the pain. It doesn't justify the imbalance. But it reframes the outcome. Vanessa and I continued rebuilding slowly. There were awkward pauses. Old patterns resurfaced occasionally. But now, when they did, we named them. "You're comparing again," I told her once gently when she dismissed one of her own achievements because it didn't look impressive enough. She laughed softly. "Old habit. Doesn't mean you have to keep it," I replied. We were both learning to live without the roles that had defined us. My relationship with my mother remained more cautious. Respect, once broken, rebuilds in increments. But there was something undeniably different in her tone now. Less evaluation, more curiosity. One evening, she asked me a question she had never asked before. "Were you ever angry with me?" The honesty of it caught me off guard. "Yes," I said quietly. "I was." She nodded, absorbing the answer without defensiveness. "I didn't know how to handle that," she admitted. "I thought if I acknowledged your anger, I'd have to face my own guilt." There it was again. Fear. So much of our family dynamic had been orchestrated by fear masquerading as control. "I don't need you to rewrite the past," I told her. "I just need you to be present now." That became our working agreement. Not perfection, not grand gestures, presence. The most surprising transformation, however, came in how I spoke about my story publicly. For years, if someone asked about my childhood, I would summarize it briefly and pivot to something lighter. I didn't want to seem resentful or dramatic, but after the wedding, I began sharing more openly, not in a bitter way, but in an honest one. At a panel discussion for young entrepreneurs, someone asked me what shaped my work ethic. "I grew up in a house where stability had to be built, not inherited," I said. "That teaches you a lot." There was no shame in that sentence, only truth. Afterward, a woman approached me and said, "I always felt behind because my family didn't have money. Hearing you say that made me rethink it." That moment stayed with me. For years, I had seen my upbringing as something to quietly compensate for. Now I saw it as something to own. The wedding humiliation had not destroyed me. It had exposed a belief that no longer served me, the belief that I was slightly less. And once that belief dissolved, everything else began to realign. I no longer flinched when someone mentioned wealth. I no longer felt the need to clarify that I was doing well. I no longer categorized myself subconsciously as the other side. There was no poor side. There was simply my side. My story. My path. If I could speak to the version of myself standing in that ballroom, bouquet trembling in her hands, I would tell her this: you are not being revealed as less. You are being revealed as resilient. The insult is not a mirror. It's a projection. And the moment you understand that, the projection loses its power. Healing, I've learned, isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up quietly, in the way you stand straighter in rooms that once made you shrink, in the way you answer questions without apology, in the way you stop rehearsing conversations in your head because you're no longer trying to win them. The night my sister called me, the poor side of the family was not the end of something. It was the end of a story I had outgrown. And stepping beyond that story has been the greatest gift I never expected to receive. If you had asked me before my wedding what justice would look like, I probably would have said something dramatic: an apology in front of the same 204 guests, a public acknowledgement that I had been underestimated, some visible reversal of status that would balance the scales. But now, looking back, I understand that justice didn't arrive the way I imagined. It didn't come as humiliation returned. It didn't come as revenge. It came quietly through clarity. Months after the wedding, life settled into something steady. My relationship with my mother was no longer defined by silent resentment. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when old instincts flickered, when she would almost slip into comparison, when I would almost minimize myself. But now we recognized those moments. We corrected them. She began showing up to my events, not to critique, but to observe. She asked thoughtful questions about my clients, about the logistics of large-scale productions, about the emotional weight of orchestrating other people's most important days. She listened. Listening, I realized, had always been what I wanted. Not money, not status, not even praise. Just presence. Vanessa's transformation was slower, less linear. Growth rarely moves in a straight line. There were days she seemed confident in her new self-awareness, and days she slipped back into old patterns, seeking validation through appearance, measuring her worth by who admired her. But now, when she faltered, she didn't deflect it onto me. She owned it. One evening, she called unexpectedly. "I got offered a job that looks impressive," she said, "but I don't actually want it." "Then why consider it?" I asked. "Because it would look good to Mom," she admitted. There was a pause. "I don't want to live like that anymore," she added. For the first time, I heard uncertainty instead of arrogance. And I recognized something in her voice that I had once carried myself: the fear of disappointing a parent. "You don't owe anyone a performance," I told her gently. Neither of us did. My father remained the quiet constant in all of this. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and I joined him for dinner at the wooden house. The same creaky floors, the same modest kitchen, the same warmth. As we sat around the small table, I found myself looking at the walls differently. Not as evidence of what I lacked growing up, but as proof of what I had. Consistency, effort, unconditional love. After dessert, my father raised his glass. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. "Not because you proved them wrong, but because you didn't let bitterness take over." His words struck deeper than he probably realized. Bitterness had been an option. It would have been easy to retreat into resentment, to replay the insult endlessly, to weaponize the truth against my family, the way they had once weaponized image against me. But holding on to anger would have meant staying tethered to the very narrative I was trying to outgrow. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about pretending something didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let that hurt define you. It took me time to understand that forgiving my mother didn't mean excusing her. It meant recognizing her limitations without absorbing them as my own. Forgiving Vanessa didn't mean forgetting what she said. It meant acknowledging the fear behind it without allowing that fear to govern my future. And forgiving myself, perhaps the hardest part, meant letting go of the belief that I had somehow earned the neglect. One night, lying beside Daniel, I voiced something that had been forming quietly in my mind. "For years," I said, "I thought justice would be watching them feel small." "And now?" he asked. Now I think Justice is not feeling small anymore. He smiled in that calm, steady way that had anchored me from the beginning. You've always been enough, he said. I believed him, not because he said it, but because I finally knew it. The phrase poor side of the family had once felt like a verdict. Now it felt almost irrelevant. Poverty isn't measured by square footage or imported linens. It's measured by scarcity of empathy, scarcity of accountability, scarcity of love, and I had never been poor in the ways that truly mattered. The wooden house that once felt like a symbol of difference now felt like a foundation. It had taught me how to build from nothing, how to create beauty without excess, how to value substance over spectacle. My career flourished in ways that felt grounded rather than reactive. I stopped overachieving to compensate. I worked because I loved the craft, not because I needed to prove something. When I walked into rooms filled with wealth and influence, I no longer felt like an outsider. I felt like a professional, a creator, a woman who built her own stability. And when I returned to my father's porch, watching the sun dip behind familiar trees, I felt equally at home. That balance between worlds, between past and present, was something I once believed I needed to choose. I don't anymore. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration became a reckoning, a mirror held up to long-avoided truths. But it also became a doorway. Through it, I stepped into a version of myself that wasn't defined by comparison. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Sometimes the most painful moments aren't punishments, they're revelations. They reveal the narratives you've been living under without questioning them. They reveal the beliefs you've internalized without realizing. They reveal the places where you've been shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. And once revealed, those narratives can be rewritten. Not by shouting louder, not by humiliating someone in return, but by standing still and deciding that your worth was never up for debate. Today, when I look back at that ballroom filled with 204 guests, I don't see the night I was humiliated. I see the night I stopped negotiating my value. The night I stopped waiting to be chosen. The night I realized that justice isn't about making someone else pay. It's about reclaiming yourself. And once you reclaim yourself, nothing anyone says can make you small again. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that humiliation doesn't define you, your response to it does. What happened at my wedding wasn't just a family conflict or a dramatic speech gone wrong. It was the exposure of a 30-year narrative built on comparison, silence, and unspoken fear. It showed how easy it is to internalize someone else's insecurity and mistake it for truth. And more importantly, it showed how powerful it is to break that cycle without becoming cruel in return. This wasn't a story about revenge, it was about reclaiming identity, about understanding that being overlooked doesn't make you less valuable, about realizing that justice isn't watching others fall, it's finally standing firm in your own worth. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the lesser sibling, the quiet one, the one who had to prove themselves, you're not alone. Stories like this remind us that healing is possible, and strength doesn't have to be loud. For more powerful emotional stories about family, resilience, and personal transformation, subscribe to Hanji Iyagi. Stay with us, because sometimes, the most important turning point in life begins with a single sentence.